I would like to thank National Pork Board for the opportunity. This project is a fairly large undertaking. It was a collaborative effort with the University of Illinois and USDA Meat Animal Research Center. But I also want to provide credit where credit's due. Most of what you're going to see today are the efforts of Miss Emily Arkfeld's in the back. This is part of her research project. So a lot of what you're seeing is because of her efforts. When we started out, our objectives were really threefold. We wanted to correlate fresh loin quality with ham quality, processed ham quality, and belly quality. So in other words, when we conduct a meat quality research trial, oftentimes at the University of Illinois, we use the loin as our benchmark, and then we blanket statement that to say that this feed additive did this management process did this to quality overall. And so we really wanted to establish those relationships, I've lost my clicker already, with the loin and all the other primals. Then we wanted to characterize the variation that packers are experiencing in the pigs that we're supplying in the industry today. And then finally, we wanted to evaluate seasonality. Dr. Zavransky really talked in depth earlier this afternoon about seasonality. The first two of these objectives are what we're going to talk about today. So the winter-fed pigs were already dead. We slaughtered those in February and March of this year. The summer pigs are on slate to be slaughtered July and August. So we're going to talk about the first two objectives on the slides. As I said, the winter pigs are dead. We killed these pigs over 4 weeks. And basically what we did is we set this up that we had two different genetic lines. We had a line that was selected for fast growth, lean quality, lean protein development, but only adequate meat quality. And then we had a genetic line that was bred to grow adequately fast, be adequately efficient, but to really have desirable meat quality traits. We then identified 4 suppliers that provided a barn of about 1,000 pigs roughly. So we were looking at barns that had at least 1,000 pigs that marketed pigs in groups of 3 cuts. So they topped the barn, they had a middle, and then they had a run out. And our objective was to best we can to characterize, if you look at the literature, oftentimes cut, the effects of tops versus runouts versus middle cuts is confounded with kill day. And so we were trying to manage that as much as possible. We certainly didn't get it completely accomplished, but you can see there in February 23rd, we had cuts seconds compared directly with runouts, and then in March 9th, we had runouts compared, or I had that backwards, with tops. And so that way we had the second cuts were essentially our control throughout the experiment. Our objective, as I said, we wanted 4 barns that had at least 1,000 pigs in that barn. So delivered to the plant as candidates for our research trial, we had 4,516 animals. That included every pig that was delivered to this particular packer. Of those, we were trying to capture at least 90% and characterize 90% of those pigs on a set parameter. We ended up characterizing 4,289 in our initial group, 95%. So we felt pretty good about the way, about our ability to characterize those. Then you can see basically a frequency table of how those cuts and how those barns were distributed. You can see there in blue, for example, barn A represented 24% of our population. If we're going across the other way, 33% of our pigs were from the top cuts. And so that's how we arrived at that 4,300 number. We did not control sex, but we did characterize sex such that you can see how the barrows and gilts were distributed within our cuts. For the entire population, we tried to characterize a lot of the things that Dr. Newman had just talked about. We tried to capture hot weights. We tried to get some fattometer information, so we had carcass data. We tried to get those CMF, color, marbling, and firmness information that Dr. Newman just talked about. We characterized iodine value. We had an estimation of tenderness and slice shears. We characterized the ham weights on every carcass, and then objective color of the ham face. This is the only slide I'm going to show that really compares genetics and cut, primarily because the objective of the talk is to talk about how these things are related, how primals are correlated, more so than the cuts. But what you'll notice is that the guys that are pulling these pigs out of these barns and sending them to market did a fantastic job. No effects of cut within this population, no interactions with cuts and genetics, but we did see the effects that you would anticipate between the high lean lines and the high quality lines. And there's those differences expressed in a table. As I said, we characterized and we weighed all of those hams, and we got objective color, that L-star value that Dr. Newman had talked about, on 2 different muscles in the ham. And I show you that because I'm going to present several of these tables that are just simply correlation tables. And I want to talk about what a correlation means. Correlation, for those not familiar, does not equal causation. We're simply talking about relationships, how one parameter relates to the other. I'm going to point that out in two different examples here. We have the relationship with ham weight and hot carcass weight with a correlation of 0.86, and we have the relationship with a gluteus profundus L-star value and the loin depth. And so we have what we would call a very strong correlation at 0.86 and a very weaker correlation at 0.01. And to show you what that looks like graphically, if you look on the left, as hot carcass weight gets heavier, very logically the ham gets heavier as well. Allometric growth held true. And so that's a strong relationship at 0.86. The contrast to that is a very weak relationship where you essentially see a shotgun blast. Very little relationship between those two parameters. So I just wanted to put that out there to keep that in mind as we're talking about correlations and what correlation means when we talk about the relationship of these parameters. Of those 4,300 animals then, we went back and we selected 10% of that population to do a more in-depth analysis. The USDA team did all the loin work, the loin quality work, and the folks at the University of Illinois evaluated all the hams. We also did some implant work on the bellies, but less so on that primal than the others. Of that 10%, we characterized 30-minute pH. We monitored temperature decline of the loin muscle and the inner ham muscle. We monitored ultimate pH, loin purge, fresh belly dimensions, fatty acid profiles, and ham processing characteristics. Those carcasses were selected as they came down the slaughter line. They were numbered sequentially 1 to N, essentially. Every 10th carcass, or every carcass that ended in a 1, 11, 21, 31, 41, 51, was our selected carcass. You can see our example here at 91. Those carcasses were identified on the shoulder and on the inner ham. For those, just like with the master population, our subsample, there was 460 animals of those. It was our objective to characterize 10%. We came almost 11, so we did pretty well. Again, our distribution of barrows and gilts are pretty representative of the master population. As we start to look at temperature decline, this is simply the decline of the longissimus muscle, the loin muscle, and that inner ham. There's a couple things I want to point out here. One, the loin was cooler than the ham throughout the entire chilling process, all the way out to 22 hours post-mortem. The loin chilled at a more rapid rate than the ham, and the loin reached equilibration temperatures earlier. So essentially, if you look from 3 to about 6 hours post-mortem, that loin is really chilling pretty quick. And then when we get to about 14 hours post-mortem, the loin has pretty much stopped chilling. Temperature's pretty much equilibrated. And I say that to point this out. This is the correlation, again, that relationship between the loin temperature and the ham temperature. And so as we can see initially, when we put those temper quarters into those muscles at about 30 minutes post-mortem, shortly after they were stunned, eviscerated and such, we get a correlation of about 0.3. So to put that into perspective, we're able to explain about 10% of the variation in temperature using about 10% of the variation of these two muscles. That starts to deteriorate as we move from 3 to 4 hours. Again, the loin is chilling at a more rapid rate, and then we start to get an increase in that relationship up to about 0.7 at about 14 hours post-mortem. And then as the loin has begun to equilibrate, that relationship again deteriorates. So at that point, it doesn't matter how big the loin was, how heavy the loin was, they've all equilibrated to the proper temperature. And so then if we look at our predictive ability of hot weight, essentially, but also loin depth and carcass, loin depth and fat depth to predict carcass temperature, there's two things from this line. The red line there is the predictive ability of the inner ham muscle. It's pretty poor, relatively poor. Contrast to that, the loin actually is pretty good at about 3 hours post-mortem, and then as we continue to chill that loin, or as that loin approaches ambient temperature, the predictive ability of hot weights to predict loin weights become less. And I'm getting a puzzled look from Dr. Savransky. Is it not clear what I'm looking at? Okay. I can't fix bad eyes. I can hopefully try to explain it a little better. So then, we want to start talking about correlations. How am I doing on time? Good?
Good.
Awesome. So if we talk about correlations, again, the relationship with hot weights with our meat quality parameters. So if we look along the meat quality parameters we just talked about, it's exactly the parameters that Dr. Newman had shared earlier. The only difference, SSF is slice shear force, so we use slice shear as opposed to Warner Bratzler. Basically a different technique to capture the exact same information. But essentially, this is what most meat quality papers do. If they're going to make a correlation, they're going to look at the hot carcass weight, carcass characteristics, fat depth and loin depth, and they're going to correlate those to the meat quality parameters. If you look, we get some very statistically significant correlations, meaning that we've put enough power into our study to get things to be statistically significant at the 0.05 level, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the relationships are that strong. And so if we look here, we get correlations with hot carcass weights and loin depths somewhere between the 0.1 to 0.2 range. Okay, so we're talking about explaining the variation of about 2 to 5% of one trait to the other based on these correlations. They do make sense though. If we think about them logically and we think about them biologically, as back fat increased, marbling increased, that makes sense. Purge loss decreased, and loins became more tender. Okay, and we can think our way through those correlations rationally that probably makes sense. But what we wanted to talk about is what is the relationship with loin quality to ham quality, loin quality to belly quality, and ham quality to belly quality. And so we start looking at those. Correlations of fresh ham quality to loin quality. And again, we have our meat quality traits along the bottom or on the side here, and our ham weights and our two objective color measurements across the top. And we see basically the same story. That there's some relationships there. We get some statistical correlations there. Some at 0.24, 0.23. So again, we're starting to approach what we would consider a moderate correlation, somewhere around 0.3, around 10% of the variation. People would say that we're probably starting to get some correlation, but they're still pretty weak in the big picture. If we look at correlations with fresh ham quality on belly quality, as hams became heavier, bellies became heavier, they become longer, wider, thicker, and they become more firm. Kind of makes sense, right? As a pig gets bigger, he deposits more fat, he's going to make a fatter belly. That fatter belly's adipocytes are going to fill with lipid, it's going to be more firm. Again, makes some logical sense, but if we study the correlations, they're still relatively weak. And you can see that right there. If we look at those scatter plots again, with ham weight and belly thickness at a correlation of 0.35, you can see a pattern there, but you've got to use your imagination just a little bit to kind of pick it out. Same with flop. Now flop, I will say, was a categorical evaluation, so those were, rather than a continuous variable where we measured belly flop, we actually physically handled those bellies and called them subjectively either a 0.5, a 1, a 2, a 3, or 4, a 5, and so that's why that graph looks just a little bit funny relative to the others. If we correlate our belly quality with our loin quality, basically the same exact scenario. We're seeing relationships, they are statistically significant, but they're in that 0.1 to 0.2 to 0.3 range. Those that you can start to look at, start to have some feelings about what they represent, but again, we've got to keep it into perspective of what we're actually dealing with. And so just to summarize, to kind of wrap it up quick, for this is half of those pigs. These are the pigs that were killed during the winter season. The summer season are still to come. And as Dr. Savransky told us earlier, sometimes our results can change by adding more information. So I'm going to basically say this with a caveat that these are just for those winter pigs that cut did not affect carcass characteristics. So again, the guys pulling the pigs out of the barn that are marketing our first, second, and third cuts did a phenomenal job that we didn't see any differences in carcass weight, no differences in loin depth, fat depth, or estimated lean. We saw no interactions between genetics. So basically, our pigs selected for high growth and our pigs selected for high meat quality responded the same. Primal weights were positively correlated with each other. I say that because just to provide some logical explanation, allometric growth held true. Bodies got heavier, the hams got heavier, the bellies were heavier, everything kind of moved in that right direction. Ham and loin were moderately related, and I'll wrap up with just a second with that point. As hams became heavier, bellies became thicker and firmer. And so as a concluding thought, as I was putting this together, Dr. Larson challenged me to make sure that I bring this all back and that we have a final take-home message for everybody. And I think for me, the take-home message is if we study these correlations, there are some statistic correlations, there are some things that move in the right direction, but we've got to be careful if we're evaluating loin quality that we don't necessarily extrapolate high loin quality to good ham quality or to good belly quality, and that perhaps if we're interested in belly quality or ham quality, maybe we should just measure it.